a rebellious teenager, a hands-off mother, and a strict stepfather. It was a recipe for disaster. The investigation would leave detectives scrambling to answer two questions. Had a rebellious teen gone too far? Or was she acting under parental supervision? On October 23, 2005, Cushing, Texas, it was a little after 7 a.m. when the phone rang at Francis and David Bones' house. The caller was their son, James Kelly's wife, Marsha Gail Kelly. And she needed a favor. James wasn't answering his phone. Marsha was all the way at the hospital, wrapping up her night shift, and her truck driver husband needed to get an early head start on some repairs to his rig. He wanted Marsha to call him at 7 a.m. to wake him up, but he wasn't responding. So David Bones went next door to wake up James. But James didn't answer the older man's knock. So he went inside. That's when he found James lying in bed, eerily still, with a quilt pulled up over his head. He kept calling James and couldn't wake him up. He took his walking stick and poked his foot, and still nothing. He then pulled the quilt off of his stepson, and realized why he wasn't responding. James Kelly was dead. Marsha was only 21 when she met James Kelly, but she had already been married, divorced, and a mother. She also had a bit of a reputation from her past of being a rebellious teen. She quit school in 9th grade and started hanging out in the wrong crowds. In fact, that's how she met James in 1992. 2 years younger than Marsha, James was a classic good old boy. He liked anything loud and fast. They did a lot of street racing together back in the day. Marsha seemed like the perfect girl for him. James and Marsha dated on and off for a few years. Then, two events changed their lives. In 1995, a probation violation put James behind bars. While in jail, they would communicate back and forth. And when he got out, he started pulling his life together. Meanwhile, Marsha was dealing with a tragedy of her own. Her mother and her daughter Caitlin died in a house fire. And the disaster almost claimed the life of her oldest daughter as well. Shania attempted to ride her bicycle out in the middle of traffic to be with her grandma and her sister. The event landed 6-year-old Shania a short stay in a mental institution. From that age on, Shania was a child that didn't get attached to anyone. The whole incident turned into a wake-up call for Marsha. She went back to school to become a respiratory therapist. Released from prison, James saved up enough money to buy a truck and went into business for himself. He had really seemed to straighten his life out. He was a hard-working individual, and before long, James and Marsha's on and off-again relationship was back on. And in 2003, the couple married and moved onto James's mother's property into a double-wide trailer, with James's 2 sons and Marsha's daughter. By that time, James had acquired 3 trucks and his one-man operation turned into a small firm. Marsha was making good money too. She invested some of her hospital salaries into a side business. She bought some bouncy houses and started a part-time rental business that she would do on the weekends. On top of continuing her work as a therapist, she also did the paperwork for the trucking company. They both stayed really busy, but the money they made together gave them ample opportunity to enjoy their time together. James and Marsha had many hobbies. One of them being arguing. James always thought he was right, and Marsha always thought she was right. Somebody has to be wrong, there can't be 2 rights. But after every argument, James and Marsha found a way to make up. He loved her. She wanted a car, he bought her a '68 Camaro. She wanted a 4-wheeler. He bought her a 4-wheeler. By 2005, the blue-collar couple was moving into the middle class, but their material possessions masked tensions threatening to tear the family apart. October 5, 2005, Marsha found herself in the middle of another argument. This time it wasn't with her husband but with her 16-year-old daughter Shayna. By the time police showed up, Marsha and Shayna were physically fighting. Shayna was arrested and, as a result, placed in juvenile detention. Shayna's arrest was the combination of a battle brewing since Marsha's marriage to James. Even in the best circumstances, a stepfather has difficulty transitioning into fatherhood with a young teenage daughter. But because of Shayna's traumatic experiences growing up, it was tough for James to build a relationship with her. Shayna began skipping school regularly and falling in with a tough crowd. It was a world Shania's stepfather knew well. A world James was determined to keep his stepdaughter away from. James always tried to correct Shayna and be a father figure to her, but Shayna didn't want that. She made it clear that he wasn't her father. The friction between James and Shayna had led to arguments between James and Marsha. They had different ways of raising the kids. With Marsha and James fighting over her, Shayna began to feel unwelcome and moved in with her boyfriend at only 14 years old. With Marsha doing absolutely nothing to stop her. Within a few weeks, Shayna was back home, and by 2005, James' tougher parenting approach was starting to rub off on Marsha. When Shayna moved out again at 16, Marsha went and got all of her things and made her move back home. Within days, mother and daughter had come to blows again. If James and Marsha had planned the arrest would turn Shayna around, they were sadly mistaken. If anything, she became wilder. Taking up with a new 23-year-old boyfriend named Dallas Christian, a registered sex offender, not ideally someone you want for your daughter. Marsha approved, but James didn't. Patience was wearing thin for James, and fights between James and Shayna began to take on a more threatening tone. Shayna began to tell James regularly that she's going to kill him. Saturday, October 22, 2005 was technically a day off for James, but with a large fleet of trucks to maintain, being able to take a full day off was difficult for him. By 6, when Marsha was starting her overnight shift at work, she had talked to James on the phone and he was up to his elbows in engine oil and he would stay at it until 3 a.m. Luckily, he could go home to peace because Shayna was staying out the night with her boyfriend, Dallas Christian, and a younger boy by the name of Colton Weir. Before James went to bed, he talked to his wife on the phone and requested a wake-up call for 7 a.m. But James would not be answering his wake-up call. David Bones tried waking him up at 8 a.m. and realized his face was all bloody. He couldn't tell if he had been badly beaten or shot, but he knew he wasn't breathing. With the sheriff on the way, David called his stepdaughter back and told her that James was in serious trouble and wasn't responding and to get home fast. Although she was apparently too shaken to drive herself, she called a friend of the family to pick her up to bring her home. While Marsha and Kevin sped towards her house, deputies were arriving on the scene. They found James's mother, stepfather, and a growing number of friends and family members. Once law enforcement went inside to look at James, they found evidence that James had been shot in the face. It didn't seem to be a robbery. The house and all its valuables remained untouched. While detectives were analyzing the crime scene, Marsha arrived home. She calmly walked over to talk to an officer, and then went inside to feed the dogs. Flat. Emotionless. While the coroner removed James from the bed, police interviewed her. They wanted to know if she knew of anyone that would want to harm James. While police were questioning Marsha, they were getting different answers from family members outside. Shayna's name came up a few times. Law enforcement was also familiar with the relationship between James and Shayna. She would frequently spar with her stepfather, and several of the young men she ran with had police records. Law enforcement tracked down Shania and the 3 boys she was with the night of her stepfather's murder. They all had similar stories, but there were too many inconsistencies to be overlooked. The officers knew they were sitting across from their culprits, and they knew how to get answers. They sat down one-on-one with the youngest of the trio. On the verge of tears, Colton sat down in the interrogation room. Law enforcement was quick to pick up on his guilt and took advantage of it. They found out the murder was pre-planned and wondered what would cause these 3 teenagers to do such a heinous crime. Police were shocked to learn why. Colton claimed that Marsha was paying them to kill her husband. A shocking statement. But was it true? Police continued to interrogate the other teenagers separately. They sat down once more with Dallas and asked him who was at the head of this plan to kill James. His response: Shania and Marsha. And he had proof. He stated that after Colton shot James in the head, Shania took James's cell phone and called Marsha to confirm the hit job was complete. Police were able to subpoena phone records to back up Colton and Dallas's version of events. There was proof that Shania had called her mother before and after the shooting through cellular data. Marsha is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Her daughter, Shania Sepulveda, and her ex-boyfriend Colton were serving life in prison, with the possibility of parole. Dallas Christian also pled guilty and was sentenced to 40 years in 2008.